Hello and welcome to the first video in this middle game chess strategy series, which was requested by a viewer. So if you'd like to see something in future videos, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try and do a video for that. So how can you improve your chess middle game? Well, there's probably different ways, but one good way can be to look at the games of the best players. And so today I have a game between Anish Giri with the white pieces versus Magnus Carlsen. And Magnus Carlsen wins this game. So we can take a look at what strategy was used. I'll discuss that a little bit. I'll have the computer evaluation up there so we can see what the computer recommends as well. And so let's see what Magnus did here. He played 97.7% accuracy versus 81.9% by his opponent. And we see the game was pretty even until the last third, where he gained an advantage before increasing it for the win. So now let's see what he did. All right, I'll turn on the computer analysis here, and I'll discuss different tips for strategy in the middle game as well. All right, the game begins with e4, e6, and we have the French defense. So one piece of strategy that comes right out of the opening, which I'll talk a little bit of that before we go into deeper middle game strategy. We already see that white has more space because his pawn is, of course, pushed further than black's. So after d4, a common strategy in the opening, even though this is a middle game video, will lead into the middle game with this strategy. So immediately, if you're going to let white take the center like this, you want to try and fight back in the center, which is what Magnus does. And now we have e5, the advanced variation of the French defense. So a good piece of middle game strategy, and it can start right in the opening like it does here, is to try and gain more space than your opponent and then try and use that space to your advantage. How can you do that? Well, you give your pieces more room to maneuver. So with that extra room, you have more space to operate in. Your pieces aren't as congested, whereas black's position is a little bit cramped here. So a good piece of middle game strategy would be with white to try and avoid trading too many pieces, because you have that extra space, and as more pieces come off the board, that extra space could be hard to cover with a limited number of pieces, whereas black wants to trade off pieces to relieve their cramped space on their side of the board. So the game continues with c5, a common strategy in the French defense, where we have a pawn chain, and that pawn chain is aimed towards the king side, and that's another thing I'll talk about as well. The direction that your pawns point can help you decide where to attack on the board. So here, a good strategy is to attack the base of the pawn chain, which is this square right now. So Giri, of course, defends the pawn, creates a new base of the pawn chain on b4 here. So the game continues with knight developing, and then we have a little bit more pressure being added here. Two attackers, but of course there are two defenders at the moment. And now the pieces are just being developed here by both sides. So I'll go ahead and show some moves before we get into the middle game here. So both sides are developing. What does this move do here? Well, a good piece of middle game strategy is to place your knights where they back one another up. So for whatever reason, if there were exchanges here, maybe the knight could jump in here after the first knight is traded off. But also, another strategy is to try and look for outpost squares to place your pieces, especially the knights. So Magnus might be headed here. An outpost can be better as you move towards your opponent's side of the board. But here, it's still not bad, especially with this cramped position that black has. And from there, the knight would put even more pressure on that d4 pawn. So we have castling. Finally, an exchange in the center. So one piece of strategy can be to exchange your flank pawn, one of your pawns on the side, with a central pawn. But here we just have a recapture, keeping the balance in the center. And we see these pawns are aimed towards the king side, and Magnus's pawns in the center, the central pawns, are aimed towards the queen side. So that generally, as a guideline, that generally means that you want to attack in the direction of those pawns. And how would you do that? Well, white in the future might try to push this pawn up the board. So, another good reason to put that knight here to block that. And Magnus might funnel his pieces over to where he has more space on the queen side and try and attack there, maybe by pushing his pawns. So the knight does move forward here. And you might say, well, he could just be attacked by this pawn. That's possible, but then it would kind of weaken white's king side a little bit, perhaps. So now we have continued development by both sides. And a good piece of middle game strategy here. You want to try and activate your rooks. You don't want them just playing guard duty where they're passive. And rooks are best placed on open or half open files. And here we have an entirely open file. So one strategy might be to double the rooks up on this open file. And then, if you could end up getting one of your rooks on the 7th rank for black here, and then the best strategy, or one of the best strategies, is to, in the middle game, or at any point in the game, but often in the middle game, if you can get both of your rooks on your 7th rank, which would be white's 2nd rank here, that can be a great strategy because there's often so many pawns on that rank, and the rooks can target those. So the game continues here with an interesting move. The computer says it's a good move. Now, why might this have been played? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but maybe there was a plan to push here and attack that knight, and then place the rook on this half open file, because most likely black will castle over here. So that may be the thinking there. All right. We have a preventative move, or a prophylactic move. And this move could be double faceted. It could have defensive and offensive properties. Maybe by pushing this pawn, it covers the b5 square, preventing the knight or the bishop landing there. Also, maybe Magnus wants to push that b pawn to b5 because, as I said, his pawns are aiming towards the queen side. So, most of the time you want to operate in the direction that your pawns are pointing, your central pawns, I should clarify, because there's more room over here. So you might want to push the pawn and then funnel your pieces in behind. So let's see what happens. We have an additional developing move, bishop to g5 here, targeting the queen. So what is played here? The queen just gets out of the line of fire and targets an unprotected pawn on b2, as well as adding a third attacker to this valuable central pawn here on d4. So at this point, The game is what, almost even. So maybe just a slight edge for white here. And now we have the best move being played where the queen is targeted here. And now, these knights don't have time to start attacking, of course, because the queen would be captured. But what does Magnus do? He just backs that queen up, getting out of the way of this b pawn, which could potentially chase the knight here. And he keeps pressure on that d4 pawn. So another great piece of strategy is to look for weaknesses. Now, I do a lot of videos on pattern recognition and puzzles, which are mostly involving tactics. And you have to remember, middle game strategy, the better you get at that, the better, or I should say, the more you'll see opportunities for tactics pop up. Because a lot of times there might not be any tactical options in the position, but if you slowly increase your small advantages, like gaining more space, developing your pieces into the center, the better developed you are, and maybe the more space you have, the more you might have opportunities, especially tactical opportunities that could pop up. So the game continues here with the best move being played. We have the bishop dropping back to help defend here. So 3 defenders, and then we have 3 attackers. And that's something you'll see as far as middle game strategy, where play can revolve around a color on the board, a group of colored squares, whether they're light or dark, or a individual pawn like this. So, this one square here on d4 is the central focus in this game. So let's see how things play out. Well, we have bishop developing. Now, Magnus could have just knocked out the bishop pair, which is a sensible middle game strategy. And why would you want to go and get rid of your opponent's bishop pair? Well, if you knock out one of the bishops, so if this knight would have captured the bishop here, that dark squared bishop is gone, whereas Magnus would still have his dark squared bishop. And then there's an opportunity to use that dark squared bishop in some kind of attack, because the opponent doesn't have a dark squared bishop anymore to counter that. Now, why didn't Magnus capture immediately here? Well, maybe he's thinking that this is a bad bishop. So another piece of middle game strategy is try and keep your good bishop and get rid of the bad bishop. And if any beginners or anyone not familiar with good or bad bishops, a bad bishop is like this one on e3, which is blocked by pawns that are on the same colored squares, especially in the center here, as the bishop. So that bishop is really limited in its mobility because of these these pawns on the same colored squares in the center. Whereas, the light squared bishop can maneuver around those. And on the other side of the board, this light squared bishop is black's bad bishop because of all these light squared pawns. And, so sometimes you don't want to knock out the bishop pair if it gets rid of this knight for the bishop. But, then you just kind of have to play regularly and get a feel for the positions to see what decision you might want to make. All right, so the computer says this is an inaccuracy. It preferred rook to c1, which could help fight for the open central or the open c file here, which remember, a great middle game strategy is to take control of open files with the rooks. So don't let, on the opposite end of that, don't let your opponent take over the open files. So we have b5 being played. So space is gained here on the queen side, and the knight is under attack. So after a retreat, which is the best square, you know, you might think, well, could he have gone here on this outpost? And once again, if you're not familiar with an outpost, it's basically a square that is usually protected by a pawn and can't be attacked by pawns. Now, not always. Sometimes there might be an opportunity to attack a piece on an outpost, and knights are especially well placed strategically on outposts. And if the knight would have landed here, well, it could have been captured, perhaps. You know, and maybe the opponent didn't want to go trading pieces, and it would also weaken this pawn here. So instead, we have the retreat. The game continues with castling finally by Magnus, and he pretty much has all his pieces developed. You know, maybe not this rook, but sometimes that rook is best left here on both sides. The rook may be best left on the f-file, especially if you want to push forward here, or if white tries to push here, which, you know, the knight is in the way at the moment. But that's another middle game strategy. If you have a pawn chain, like white does here, there's two ways to attack it. Usually you want to attack it at the base, because that's like the foundation of the pawn chain. And if you can knock out the foundation, then the rest of the chain will have problems. It'll be harder to defend that E pawn here, you know, especially that this F pawn can't immediately get up there to defend it. So if you can't or don't want to attack the base of the pawn chain, the other option might be attacking the top of the pawn chain, you know, which would be up here on E5. And so a way to do that might be to push this pawn, and, you know, white could capture, or you could capture, but then you'd see that the rook on the F file would be opened up a little bit and have more maneuverability. So not only do you want to place rooks on open or half open files, you can also put them behind pawns that you plan to push forward in the future to open up files or even gain space for that rook. So the game continues with this move here, which targets that knight. And so the threat is to capture and break the pawns apart, which would, you know, leave doubled pawns on the F file and an isolated pawn here on D5. So a great piece of middle game strategy is to try and bust up the pawns, leaving them isolated or doubled, or even backward pawns, which I'll get into this stuff more in future videos, especially for any beginners that are kind of confused. But the reason you want to keep your pawns all side by side here without, you know, isolating them, if a pawn is all alone and it's isolated with no pawn on either side of it, well, then it's an easier target. Whereas if you have this pawn here, for example, the only way to attack that usually is with, you know, another pawn here, because it's protected by the pawn on D4. Whereas when you start isolating pawns or doubling pawns, especially doubled pawns, they kind of impede the mobility of the pawn behind it. And if you wreck your pawn structure, they can become easier easier targets. Also, the less islands of pawns that you have, the harder it'll be for your opponent to target weaknesses. So we'll take a look at that as the game progresses. Right now, if you're not sure about what islands are, basically this is a pawn island, two pawns together here. And then as there's no pawns on the C file, then we have another pawn island here. Now this could all be considered one pawn island because these pawns are all side by side, even though they're separated a little bit here. So right now we have two pawn islands, on each side here. This pawn island, and then all the pawns on the middle and king side over here. All right, so we have the best move being played by Magnus Carlsen, and with this move, it looks like black has a slight edge. He's gotten rid of the bishop pair of his opponent while keeping his own bishop pair. And also, after the capture here, it's created doubled pawns, which could be a weakness. Now, the base of the pawn chain that was on d4 is now defended. And so there's kind of a new base of the pawn chain on e3. But now white has 3 pawn islands here. One in the center and one on each side, whereas Magnus only has 2. So his pawns are situated a little bit better, and it'll be harder to attack them. Whereas white's pawns are getting a little weaker here. So the game continues with an attack by the b4 pawn, pushing forward here. And this is an interesting strategy where in chess, especially if you're limited on options, if there's no good tactics and you're trying to see if you can improve your pieces and you're not sure what to do, one strategy can be to look for a way to push your pawns forward and attack. Here you notice we have the knight under attack, so that kind of limits the opponent's options. White either has to capture here or has to move that knight. So he doesn't want to reduce the knight's position. Maybe he could try and jump forward, but I don't know, that's kind of dangerous because there could be a discovered attack on an unprotected piece there. So, of course, he attacks, capturing the pawn here towards the center, opening up the A file for his rook here. So, that's a good piece of strategy. Capturing with the pawn, opening up the rook, and now Magnus succeeds in recapturing here, driving his knight forward. In general, it can be better to move your pieces forward, especially into your opponent's position. And a good piece of middle game strategy is whenever your opponent starts placing a piece or pieces on your side of the board, always take a hard look at those pieces and try and get them out of your side of the board by exchanging them off or chasing them away, because the more pieces that you can get into your opponent's side of the board, the stronger those pieces may become and the more attacking chances they might have. So here we have the knight targeting the bishop, which it also, the knight defends this attack here as well on the a6 pawn. So what is played here? Well, that bishop being attacked is ignored in favor of pushing the backward pawn here, trying to break up the center. As I mentioned, if you have a pawn chain, which we do here, the pawn chain from f7 up to d5, if you can't attack the base of the pawn chain, the other option would be to attack the head of the pawn chain. So the bishop is captured, the best move in the position, which was found by Magnus, and black has the equivalent of a half a pawn advantage after this. So we have a recapture, and the queen is pulled up to the center. So another piece of strategy you can look at is waiting for your opponent to capture your pieces so that when you recapture, it pulls an undeveloped piece like this queen onto a better square and helps develop that piece for you. So how will Magnus continue here? Well, we still have 2 attackers on that pawn, so he'll probably have to take care of that. You might think, oh, can he go here and then attack the queen and the rook here. But of course, the knight could capture, and you wouldn't want to recapture because then the queen would be attacked here. And also, that would just lose a pawn even if the queen wasn't there. So the game continues with an attack in the center. So another piece of strategy in the middle game, and really all points of the game, is if you have an attack. So if we go back here, if you have something being attacked like this pawn, a lot of times, especially beginners, will play defense. They'll get scared and figure out, oh, they're attacking, I have to defend. Well, sometimes you have an option like this capture here to counterattack, especially if it's something that's a bigger threat, which it is here. So we have an attack, and now the queen is under attack, and that has to be dealt with. So the knight captures, and the computer says that that is the best move. And then we have h6. So what does that move do? Well, it keeps knights, out of that square, trying to move closer to the opponent. And then of course, if a knight moved there, there would be a mate threat. So now we have the rook centralizing. So what does that do? Well, I don't know. The rook was on this open or half open file, but the knight was in the way. Here, we keep the knight on this central square. Rook defends the knight, getting the queen out of guard duty, and also, maybe there would have been a future threat with the bishop moving here, attacking the queen and the rook. And another strategy is now Magnus has both of the bishops here, so it's not as important, you can't really do it. But if your opponent only has one bishop, a good strategy can be to place pawns and pieces on the opposite colored squares as that bishop so that the bishop can no longer target anything. But sometimes you want to place your pawns on squares that are the same color as your opponent's bishop, because you can take possible squares away from that bishop and limit its mobility. So, there's so much to look at in chess middle game strategy that, I'll have more videos in this series, and we can look at the greatest players to see how they handle chess strategy. And if we go back to how can you improve your middle game chess strategy, well, you can definitely look at the games of great players and see how they maneuver and how they handle strategy. You want to play regularly and look at your mistakes that you've made and see what you can learn from your own games as well. And then of course you can read and watch videos to improve strategy. So the pawn pushes forward here, and that gets rid of this possible attack. So now we have the queen dropping back, renewing the attack here. And once again, the bishop doesn't want to go here, or the queen could capture, grabbing the bishop, and then we'd have an exchange of queens, but that bishop would fall. So the game continues with bishop to c6, lining up on the king. Another good piece of strategy, not only in the middle game, but in all phases of chess, is to line up a less valuable piece on a more valuable piece. So we see the bishop is lined up on the king, even though all these pieces, this pawn and the knights are in the way. You never know when things might open up and there could be an attack on that king. So here we have this attack on the knight. So what will Geary do about it? Well, he plays I believe the first mistake of the game. There were some inaccuracies by both sides, according to the computer. But queen to f4. This is a mistake that jumps. Now, there was one option that was probably hard to see, and I guess I could take a look at it. The computer says that knight to f6 is the best move, which, would probably be really hard to see for us, average players. But, a chess master, I guess this was a difficult move, or they didn't want to do it. It looks like the best move is just to move the king and leave that knight there. You could capture with the bishop, but apparently it's not a good move to do that. This would be a mistake because then the queen could capture here. And then what is the option? Wow. They recommend moving the rook out of the way here to give the, maybe rook at f to e8. The bishop could try and come up here, attack the queen, and help to defend as well. So if you did that, one thing you don't want to do, I guess, is allow this knight to come up here with the mate threat. But, this is kind of difficult to see. I mean, if that's played, I guess another option, is this threat. You just take threatening to mate, so the bishop would have to capture there. So maybe that's something to watch out for as well. What if you just captured there? Something like that. Now, why would that be terrible? I guess if you go here, the bishop is forced to capture. Queen captures with check. Oh, now it's going to lead to a mate because you have this possibility maybe of swinging over here for a mate. Yeah, so that looks too dangerous. All right, sorry to veer off course there. So in the game, we have this queen to f4 move, a mistake. Now, here's that strategy again that I mentioned, where you line up on another piece. Now, here they're equal pieces, but this is an undefended piece. So, a great piece of strategy or advice, I guess, chess guideline, is to, whenever there are unprotected pieces on the board, look for some type of tactic or a way to attack those unprotected pieces. So here, we line up on the queen, attack this unprotected pawn. So that's a piece of strategy that you can look out for. Target unprotected pieces and pawns, forcing your opponent to deal with threats. So if they're dealing with threats and they don't have any good counter threats, they'll be playing defense while you can play offense and hopefully improve your position. So the rook defends, and now we have this pawn pushing even further forward, and it is also now defended by the bishop here. So here the queen follows that piece of strategy, lining up on the king is more valuable than the queen, because if you get checkmated, the game's over. And now there could be a potential threat in the future of jumping here, because of this pawn being pinned. Also, the queen got out of the line of fire of the other queen. So Magnus presses forward with his queen, targeting yet again another unprotected piece here. So the computer states that this is an inaccuracy, but Magnus is still ahead over a pawn equivalent advantage. The computer recommends king to h8, getting out of the line of that queen. So a mistake being played here. So the second mistake by Geary, he doubles his rooks, and that's usually a good strategy to double your rooks on a file or a rank where they can complement one another, protect each other. But here, this wasn't the best move. Apparently, they like rook to f2, just moving the attacked rook, because it allows this move. Now, the rook is just targeted. You know, you can't move this rook, or the queen will just capture there. So what does Geary do? He counterattacks, targeting the bishop here. Now, that is an inaccuracy. The computer actually liked, what, knight to d6, attacking the queen. So we have capture, a queen attack here. So the fork of this bishop queen battery. And so how does the game play out here? We're about near the end. It looks like, you know, kind of a little bit of a mess happening here. The queen had to move. Magnus finds the best move in the position. Once again, he targets this unprotected knight. We have a capture. Capture by Magnus. And you know, that was the best way to go. He has his bishop on this fine outpost where it aims at the king. Once again, lining up a less valuable piece on the more valuable king. And also the bishop has two good diagonals. He could potentially drop here in the future if he has to protect this pawn. But it looks like Magnus has a winning advantage now. So let's see how he finished things up. So finally, Geary finds this knight to f6 move, but you know, now it's kind of late. The game continues with Magnus moving king to h8. And the material is recovered here. But after the queen attacks, threatening mate here, we have rook to d1. So Magnus goes in for the win. So this is how he ends it. He adds more pressure to the rook here. You know, the rook can't capture because it's pinned to the king. So there's also a new threat of mate on the back rank. And the final mistake leading to a mate in 2. Apparently, what do they recommend? The best move was h3, you know, which would have just given up the rook. So the game ends with the brilliant queen sacrifice here at the end. Magnus targets the king. The only way to handle that is to capture, and then the rook would recapture, delivering mate. So, you know, some interesting play there. You know, no matter how good your strategy gets, you still have to study tactics, because you could be a great strategic chess player, but if you miss an easy tactic, then you're in trouble. But remember that they go hand in hand. As you improve with your chess strategy, more tactics will usually become available to you, because as you learn how to increase your advantages in the position, like finding good squares for your pieces, you know, following the strategies of trying to, you know, gain space, control the center, you know, try and move your piece off the back rank, move them all off the back rank as fast as you can. But as you learn chess strategy, you'll notice more tactics appearing in your game. All right, so I've kind of drug this video out a little bit. You know, how can you improve your chess middle game? Well, many ways. Read about chess strategy, watch videos, go over games of the chess masters like this, you know, and see what they do in their chess strategy. And I hope that helps you improve. And remember to play regularly. Try, if you learn a new piece of strategy, try and incorporate it into your games as well. All right, so like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments, especially if you have any requests for future videos, something you really want to see. Like I already said, like and subscribe. But thank you for watching and have a super chess day.